Hi, welcome to Essential IT and Security Skills. I'm Charles Redmond, Master Trader, here to guide you through the essentials that you are going to need to land the job that you are looking for. In this series, we're going to talk about essential PC skills. I'm going to walk you through everything from software to hardware. Most people know me as a cybersecurity expert. Well, I couldn't have gotten there without learning the basics first. That's what this series is going to do. And then we'll move on in some later series with some more advanced concepts and techniques. But remember, it all starts with the basics. It starts right here, the essential PC skills. You're going to learn to identify different types of DRAM. We'll explain the varieties of RAM that's available, help you select and install the proper RAM for your device, and perform basic RAM troubleshooting. It all starts with SIMs. The single inline memory module. They came in 30 or 72 pin modules. Here's a picture of one. Most modern RAM or current RAM is 32 bits wide, 64 bits wide, and sometimes 128 bits wide. RAM is still described in bytes such as 1 gig sticks or 2 gig sticks. You'll have several different types of RAM to choose from. Starting with Synchronous Dynamic RAM, or SDRAM. It came on a stick called a Dual Inline Memory Module, or a DIMM. There are a wide number of pins on DIMMs. 168 pins are most common for desktops, while laptops had 68, 144, or 172. Most are 64 bits wide. However, there was the 72-pin SODIMM, which was 32 bits wide. Instead of access speed, it has a clock speed measured in megahertz. The common speeds are 66, 75, 83, 100, and 133 megahertz. Next, we have RDRAM. RDRAM could support speeds on the front side bus of up to 800 megahertz. RDRAM is most commonly referred to as RIM. Now, it doesn't stand for anything, it just happened to rhyme with SIM and DIMM. You'll find RDRAM in 184 pin sticks or 160 pin SORIMs are used in laptops. So what's unique about RDRAM is it requires all RAM slots to be populated. That means you couldn't just install a single RDRAM by itself. It had to have even a blank pair. We call those CRIMs. You see one of those at the bottom here. RDRAM really didn't last very long because it was proprietary and licensed to work only with Intel systems. The goal was to push AMD out of the RAM marketplace. However, with technology advancing as quickly as it had, fast RAM supported by AMD and other manufacturers quickly pushed RDRAM to the side, capable of making 2 processes for each clock cycle. You'll find them in 184-pin DIMMs, and it's near impossible to install it without trying real hard in the wrong slots because you have guided notches on the side. DDR SDRAM base clock is 100 MHz to 300 MHz, supported as standard system RAM even by Intel for the Pentium 4. Another primary advantage to the DDR SDRAM is now you can make use of dual channel architectures. Dual slots are often blue. The A+ certification expects you to know and understand the different rates and speeds of the different types of RAMs. Here's a chart to help keep them straight. Next we have DDR2. It doubled the clock speed to increase buffering and overall performance, and it uses 240 pin DIMMs. However, it's not compatible with the DDR DIMMs. Next, DDR3. It quadruples the clock to increase buffering and overall performance. It uses 240 pin DIMMs. However, it's not compatible with DDR2. Some chipsets that support DDR3 also support a feature called triple channel memory. It works a lot like dual channel before it, but with 3 sticks of RAM instead of 2. Intel's LGA 1366 platform supports triple channel memory. Now, there are some variations of RAM. There are double-sided RAMs. There's RAM specifically to reduce latency. However, whatever RAM you choose, remember, bigger is not always better. For instance, the high latency, high wait time takes longer for RAM to respond. So, CL3 is high latency. Lower latency or lower wait time, RAM can get the signal out in fewer clock ticks. So CL2 is low latency. The goal is to match the RAM with the motherboard. That's to say, just because you want a CL2 RAM stick, your motherboard may not be able to support it. It's also important to remember that CL2 or low latency RAM sticks are about 20 times more expensive, even though both sticks say DDR 3200. Next, we'll talk about parity and error correction. Parity allows the computer to detect whether an error occurred in reading or writing. The ECC or error correction code is an improvement over parity. Not only can errors be detected, but they can also be corrected. ECC is slower because it's doing all those extra calculations. However, the integrity of the data that you're processing will remain intact. So, what's wrong with this picture? Yeah, don't ever grab RAM by the connectors. You should always handle RAM by its sides. So, what's all this about RAM? Why is RAM so important? RAM is probably the single best way to improve your computer's overall performance and the easiest. Adding more RAM almost always improves overall system performance, processing speed, and stability. Here you see the minimum requirements for the Windows operating systems: Windows XP, Windows Vista, and Windows 7. The A+ examination expects you to know these minimum system requirements. So how do you determine what RAM you currently have in your system? Simply go to the Control panel, click on System and Security, and then click System. You'll see it roughly around the middle of the page. You see here I have 8 gigs of RAM installed in my machine. That's a lot of RAM. One of the additions starting with Windows Vista was the ability to use flash memory or a flash drive in what they called ReadyBoost. Basically, it's a way to add more RAM to your system without having to install additional RAM sticks. Simply open up your computer settings, right-click on the drive in which you want to use for ReadyBoost, click the ReadyBoost tab, and you're done. So it's important to understand that RAM is kind of fickle. It only likes to be with like RAM. It's never a good idea to mix the speeds of your RAM. Worst case, you may cause random lockups and data corruption. Best case, it'll work at its slowest speed. The good part is, RAM sticks are keyed so that they can only go in the machine one way. All you have to do is line up the keys and place the stick in the slot. Push down rather firmly and you'll hear a snap. And you're done. The SPD, or serial presence detect, once you power the PC back up, it will detect that there's new or updated RAM in the system, and then the BIOS kind of just takes it from there. Here you see how to install a DIMM stick in a computer. So if you're curious about the speeds or the rating of the RAM that you're running, you can go out and get a program called CPU-Z. Here you see in slot 2, I'm running DDR2 RAM with 1024 megabytes in size. So now that we've shown you how to install RAM in the desktop, now it's time to learn how to install RAM in your laptop. For years, it was hard to get RAM into consumer laptops, mainly because it was packaged and proprietary to the makers of that laptop. However, in recent years, it's become easier and more commonly accepted to install RAM in your own mobile devices. It's fairly simple to do. First, power off the machine, unplug it, and remove the battery pack. As we learned before, this is to protect from electrostatic discharge. Next, identify the access point for your RAM. It's usually under the keyboard or an access panel on the back of the laptop. Lastly, simply place your new RAM in your device. So what are the issues that we can run into with RAM? Some of them include parity errors, ECC errors, system lockups, page faults, and there are some other error screens within the Windows environment. It's easiest to figure out what's going on with memory errors if you write down the memory error address. If the error address changes, it's likely not a RAM failure. System lockups and page faults often indicate a RAM problem. RAM and parity errors can trigger a non-maskable interrupt or an NMI. That results in, you guessed it, the blue screen of death. There you have it. It's pretty simple. Remember, everything starts with the basics. Once you have these understood, everything gets a whole lot easier. If you have any questions or even just a comment, feel free to leave them below, and I do read each and every one of them. I'll see you next time.